Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before I get started, just wanted to remind you guys that obviously the DNC has been going on. If you've been watching the clips, the terrible interviews, the horrible speeches that have been coming out of this event, then you already know that it's a complete clown show. So to go ahead and put cherry on top of that clown show, The Blaze is having its own roast of the DNC. It begins at 9 p.m. Sharp. You're going to have the Blaze News tonight, and they'll be going commercial free with the roast session of the Democratic National Convention that'll follow. You'll have Glenn Beck, and he'll be joined by people like Dave Landau, Alex Stein, Sarah Gonzalez, Stu Berger, and Bridget Fedency. So make sure you go ahead and check in with those guys. Enjoy the roast, all the ridiculousness that is to follow after the DNC tonight. You can check that out over on Blaze TV. Joining me today is Athenian Stranger. You know, I had to do this talk about Machiavelli recently, and I went back and, of course, I read a lot of Machiavelli. But the other thing I wanted to do was look into others, the scholarship around it. And, of course, one of the most famous people to ever comment on Machiavelli is Leo Strauss. And that's a book that I've been turning over in my head. His book, Thoughts on Machiavelli, is one that I've been thinking about since I read it. So I wanted to bring someone on who is knowledgeable, familiar with Strauss and this book in particular, because Strauss is really somebody who I'm still putting my toe in the water with philosophically. So Athenian Stranger, thanks for coming on today, man.
Man, thanks so much for having me. I really, really appreciate this.
Absolutely. So for people who are unfamiliar with your background, could you explain a little bit of kind of where you come from and what you do on the internet?
Yeah, so I I originally found my way towards philosophy and political philosophy in a strange way. I have a mathematics background initially, but I just became fascinated with philosophy of math. And the next thing you know, I was in the philosophy department. Next thing you know, I didn't want to stop studying it, so I took it as far as I could go, took it as far as it goes through the PhD level. And I was just fortunate enough. I knew nothing about philosophy, but I just happened to be in some of the classrooms of some of the greatest professors on the thought of Strauss, and it just worked out really well. So, oh, and what I do, at least on Twitter, I have my Athens Corner website where I just provide lectures and things like that on all kinds of things, everything from Nietzsche to technology and science. I mean, I have a Fathers and Sons episode as well, series as well, to help fathers who are wanting to have a direct hand in educating their sons in the great books and things like that. So that's really it. I'm sort of the I've had the fortune of having a very, very good great books education as far as it can go. So.
Yeah, you also do spaces on Twitter where you almost always promise they're going to be 45 minutes, but they end up being 2 hours, but of quality philosophical content every time. So people should definitely check that out.
Yes, it's hilarious. I have many record, and I always record my spaces. So if people who are interested want to see what I have provided, at least on the Athens Corner website, in much more focused form, by the way, polished form, is the spaces that I do on philosophy and things like that, political philosophy in particular. So.
Fantastic. Well, we are going to get into Machiavelli. We're going to get into Strauss. We're going to get into what happened to political philosophy and whether it's something that needs to be repaired or restored. But before we do all that, guys, let me tell you a little bit about ISI. Universities today aren't just neglecting real education, they're actively undermining it, and we can't let them get away with it. America was made for an educated and engaged citizenry. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute is here to help. ISI offers programs and opportunities for conservative students across the country. ISI understands that conservatives and right-of-center students feel isolated on college campuses and that you're often fighting for your own reputation, dignity, and future. Through ISI, you can learn about what Russell Kirk called the permanent things, the philosophical and political teachings that shaped and made Western civilization great. ISI offers many opportunities to jumpstart your career. They have fellowships at some of the nation's top conservative publications like National Review, The American Conservative, and The College Thinker. If you're a graduate student, ISI offers funding opportunities to sponsor the next great generation of college professors. Through ISI, you can work with conservative thinkers who are making a difference. Thinkers like Chris Rufo, who currently has an ISI researcher helping him with his book. But perhaps most importantly, ISI offers college students a community of people that can help them grow. If you're a college student, ISI can help you start a student organization or a student newspaper or meet other like minded students at their various conferences and events. ISI is here to educate the next generation of great Americans. To learn more, go to isi.org. That's isi.org. All right, so let's start at the beginning here. Most people are probably at least passingly familiar with Machiavelli. You usually have to learn about him. There's a paragraph somewhere in a history book in high school. They may have even read The Prince in college because it's only 80 or 90 pages, something like that. And so people are at least somewhat familiar with his role in political philosophy. But a lot of people don't know about Leo Strauss. Could you explain a little bit about who Strauss was and kind of what he's doing?
Yeah, Strauss is just about the most controversial of thinkers. I submit for everyone's consideration. He will be remembered as a philosopher, and that's not a word to be used casually. It's very rare that there is ever a living philosopher in any of our lifetime, right? That's how rare it is. But he was a German immigrant from Germany during the Second World War, and he, in many respects, he was a student of Heidegger, but I mean, he did his PhD and everything under Ernst Cassirer, a neo-Kantian, uh, which is interesting itself because Strauss is always writing about political philosophy as opposed to what we would otherwise think of as purely philosophy, uh, things like metaphysics, epistemology, and things like that. And Strauss is known almost always mistakenly as the person who made popular looking for what we would refer to as kind of secret or hidden teachings within the great thinkers of the Western philosophical tradition. Now, there's an enormous more to it than that. It turns out that Strauss didn't begin this at all. In fact, in many respects, he got it from Nietzsche, and then from there he got it. And Nietzsche sees it in many other thinkers, particularly Francis Bacon. But this is a tradition of writing that has a very, very long history, but it's mostly been forgotten, particularly because we in the modern world, we're used to thinking that thinkers themselves will always write straightforwardly, that they're going to tell us precisely, they have their thesis that they state very clear for us. And what Strauss points out, one of his more famous popular books, Persecution and the Art of Writing, is that the threat of persecution is very real. And so our greatest thinkers, many of them, not all of them, but many of them had to write in a way that was intended for a multi-layered audience, which is to say that the author was subtle enough to leave these kind of little clues along the way that there's a deeper teaching afoot, and he can't say it out loud because, on the one hand, he himself doesn't want to face persecution, but also, and this is far, I would say, even more important, uh, because they know that the damage that certain truths can have to political community itself. Obviously, that you see how foreign that is to us today, simply by thinking of someone like Nietzsche who shouts, God is dead from the rooftops, and sort of what everybody else does. But I think when people consider at least the contemporary political climate of prosecution that all of us face for just saying what we think on social media or something like that, I think it becomes much more, at least plausible, that Strauss's elaboration of this kind of thinking is in fact something real. Um, but he focuses primarily on a criticism, it seems to be at least a criticism of what's known as historicism, particularly Heidegger's. Uh, Now, again, there's much more to it than that because he might, in fact, be far more in agreement than disagreement. But from this sort of collision between Strauss and Heidegger, uh, and then because of Heidegger's indebtedness to Nietzsche, the criticism allegedly that Strauss has with Nietzsche, he finds himself going back, following in the same tradition of Nietzsche and Heidegger, where they have these so-called destructions of the Western philosophical tradition, these return movements. And Strauss, in fact, does something similar, but he goes further, one could say even more radical than Heidegger and Nietzsche, and returns all the way back to Homer. Whereas Nietzsche goes back to the pre-Socratics, and in some respects Homer, and Heidegger, of course, only goes back to the pre-Socratics. But it's all of this is a kind of return movement to the originals, right? The source of our tradition itself. And Strauss, unlike Nietzsche and Heidegger, brings the Bible into it. He speaks of this confrontation or this tension, really, between, on the one hand, Greece, Athens, this represented in the tradition of philosophy from Greece, and the biblical tradition of Jerusalem. And so he makes that question of the tension between Athens and Jerusalem really the center stone of all of his thought. And so he refers to this as the theological political problem. And that should be understood as a constellation of very many problems or very many questions. So, for instance, poetry versus philosophy, divine revelation versus unassisted human reason. All of these things sort of come together in that. And what Strauss argues is that we better understand ourselves and our genuine tradition when we recognize the great tensions that have really sustained our tradition by not really negating either of them, but seeing how they can work in tandem, as opposed to the various syntheses that we have throughout the tradition. One could think, for instance, the most famous of them, Hegel, but then also something along the lines of a Plotinus or any number of these things. Strauss takes particular issue with the scholastics, Christian scholastics, who sought philosophy, the handmaiden of theology, etc. So that sort of thing.
So for a lot of people, and it's interesting given that kind of pretext to kind of how Strauss is approaching these thinkers, a lot of people look at Machiavelli and they think, okay, this is a guy who obviously had a significant impact. He marks a turning point of some kind in the history of thought or philosophy, but he's often relegated to, well, maybe he's just kind of this really practical political theorist, right? That he's not writing particularly long works. We don't have a large amount of philosophical content from him. The applications are almost directly political in most situations. A lot of people don't think of Machiavelli as somebody who's exploring the larger metaphysical issues. And in a lot of ways, he is a guy who is supposed to be just saying the straight truth, right? This is a reason why his books are released after his death, because he recognizes how controversial they'll be, how they're going to clash with the restrictions of the times in many ways. That's the purpose of the books, is to kind of break open the kind of stranglehold that certain beliefs had on thought and philosophy and politics at that time. And so he's not maybe someone who would initially strike a lot of people as a target for someone like Strauss, who is looking for that depth, that complexity, that hidden meaning. Why did Strauss choose Machiavelli as a target of someone to kind of elevate, at least through the level of analysis that he was going to apply?
Right. So initially, what Strauss is fundamentally concerned with as he's looking over we could say, the history of political philosophy in the West is what changes from so-called pre-modernity to modernity. And what we understand as modernity, we need to be clear, that's classical liberalism as we understand it today. So for instance, we could say beginning with Hobbes and Locke, these things. And what Strauss is trying to understand is where was the change? Because it certainly seems different looking at pre-modernity versus modernity. Everything in particular with regard to modern science, etc. And initially he thinks it's Hobbes, but he has a change of mind later on, and he says, no, I think it's Machiavelli. And what he's going to find in Machiavelli is not merely someone who's just a political theorist or a political thinker. He's going to claim that Machiavelli, in fact, is fully a philosopher, which is to say, he has a teaching on the very natures of things. And that's where most people are going to say, what the heck are you talking about? Because they're going to see in Machiavelli someone who is just what we would think of as a realpolitik, right? Realism, clear-eyed realism. And Strauss is going to take a great issue with that, because he's going to say, well, wait a minute. This thing you're referring to as realism is nothing new with Machiavelli, because simply look to Thucydides. And what Machiavelli himself does is he says, look to Xenophon, in particular, the education of Cyrus. For Machiavelli, Xenophon Cyrus is the armed prophet, new founder of new modes and institutions. So then the question is, well, what is special about Machiavelli then, if there's kind of this blurring there? And what Strauss is ultimately going to come to is he's going to say that he's going to argue that Machiavelli has a teaching of wisdom, but so that's going to make him a philosopher. But what separates him and what causes us to have a new understanding in modernity is that Machiavelli's teaching on wisdom radically separates this other virtue that we would think of as moderation. And so now you have just the truth with no adornment if needed, right? You just speak the real truths. So not even Xenophon in his small dialogue, The Hero, which is Strauss's book on tyranny, not even Xenophon argues that one should do away with the distinction between a tyrant and a king or a prince. Machiavelli simply makes no distinction. And that's where we have sort of off and running with modernity. Hobbes famously said that he said, who is this man who's speaking the truths and things like that? I mean, the influence of Machiavelli was just enormous. I mean, he's in Shakespeare, the so-called Machiavellianism that we think, that's no different than what's always been alive and well in political philosophy. It's just that now it's not even hidden. They just flatly say, it's neutral or something like that. It's like, well, this is simply the way things work, right? This is realism. This is realpolitik. But when you just concede that, you're conceding that there may not be a very inherent need for something like prudence or moderation. Noble lies, as Plato would implement, or something like that. So.
Yeah, there is this, because Strauss, while pointing to many of the qualities of Machiavelli's writing and his thought, does come out explicitly and say, basically the clever thing would be to describe this guy as a scientist. It would, the new modern way of looking at this is to describe him as someone who's just laying out the facts and the mechanisms of these things. But he said the most classical and boring approach would be to simply say this is a teacher of evil. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's not the truth. And his contention throughout, it seems, is really that Machiavelli's attempt to present these things as just basic and factual, something that is shorn of any of the fluff, the noble lie, any of these things, just to reveal the natural mechanics of power, ultimately is itself applying a value set or a lack thereof. There's kind of a negative space thing where the fact that you're removing these pretenses to a higher order or certain metaphysical principles itself underlies a worldview in which you've already made determinations on what value those things should hold inside your society.
Yeah, that really gets to, again, sort of the novelty that Strauss is going to argue in a really amazing way, as he says in the opening of the text, that academics would be scandalized or they're shocked that students would say that Machiavelli is evil. That's the great sort of scandal of academia, is that the academics themselves would not, they no longer believe in this difference between good and evil. It's just value neutral, right? And what Strauss is arguing is that that's in fact the obliteration of the distinction between tyranny and any other form of political governance. So the academics, in their shock that we would call Machiavelli evil, is sort of further influence or further proof that Strauss is really onto something with recognizing the novelty in Machiavelli, because that obliteration of, I guess we could say, good and evil, the academics being beyond good and evil, is owed to us from Machiavelli. In fact, Nietzsche himself, we should never forget, says over and over again, you need to be reading Machiavelli. In fact, in particular, The Prince. But Machiavelli greatly influenced Nietzsche greatly influenced by Machiavelli, something that's not really attended to, because again, we have these sort of dry conceptualizations of what belongs in philosophy versus what belongs in political philosophy. And exactly as you said, what Strauss is pointing out is that the problem for at least political philosophy is that people no longer even study political philosophy. They study political science, which is to say the quantification of political phenomena. It's very rare that majors in politics have to take any so-called theory courses. They might take one semester of reading Machiavelli along with Plato. So they smush everything into one semester. And then everything else is nothing more than courses on whatever is latest and greatest in politics, along with an enormous amount of quantitative courses and things like polling and such. So,
yeah, I was that rare political science major that actually enjoyed the theory. So I ended up taking the theory whenever I could, while everybody else bailed out to do the other courses. But you're right that's definitely the approach people are taking. I want to dive deeper into this. I've got a lot of questions about how this interacts with modernity, current notions of kind of the noble lie, why Machiavelli still applies, and kind of how Strauss would understand that application. But before we dive into all that, guys, let me tell you a little bit about job stacking. Hey guys, let me tell you about today's sponsor, job stacking. More paychecks, less hustle, working from home. That's what job stacking is all about. If you're a remote or hybrid worker looking to maximize your earning potential, then consider joining the Job Stacking Mentorship Program. The program is designed by Ralph Haltza, the creator of Job Stacking, to help you successfully implement a strategy that will allow you to collect multiple paychecks from different jobs without burning out or getting caught by employers. Job stacking has already helped many people double or even triple their incomes. Luke Hill, a financial analyst living in the UK, has used job stacking to stack 3 different jobs and went from making $5K a month to $15K a month. But job stacking isn't just about increasing incomes. It's also about helping our guys gain more independence by no longer being a slave to debt or a single employer who hates their values. Andrew Gustafsson, a credit analyst from Australia, is now stacking 4 salaries, which he has used to pay off his personal and student debt and buy a home for his family. If you don't currently have a remote job, no worries. The program is also designed to help you land remote jobs so that you can go ahead and get started. So if you want to double your income and stop relying on a single paycheck from a woke employer, go to jobstacking.com/start now. That's jobstacking.com/start now and book a call with Rolf today. So I think it's kind of interesting that you're talking about the way in which the value-free evaluation for Machiavelli, the implication that this could be the case, what was a big change, was a big rupture, obviously, in the approach that one would take. He's not the first person to say so many of these things, as you point out and as Strauss pointed out, but he's often the first one to say it in his own name, and to not just use this as a common, somebody who's using a character or these kind of things, but is willing to say these things directly about how you should understand and how you should act, even if those things are considered deeply immoral. At the same time, there's the kind of the current incarnation of this, where perhaps we see this as the beginning of classical liberalism, as you were talking about, a more mechanistic explanation for the universe, and then for human behavior, and then for human political organization and everything else involved. In a lot of ways, the current Machiavellian tradition, the update on that, a lot of the people who get kind of looped into this Pareto and Mosca and these kind of guys, are often being used to disassemble a lot of the classical liberal kind of noble lies, right? A lot of the things that have been become sacred inside of that tradition. So there's some kind of, I guess, maybe irony is the wrong word, but the fact that this deconstruction of the constraints that had been on philosophy and had been on thought, so that you could have a more mechanistic and practical application, a value-free application of power, these kind of things, in kind of the original Machiavellian framing, is then being used, that gives birth to the classical liberalism. That same attempt is now being brought against classical liberalism itself, and I don't know if it ultimately just kind of shows that there will always be this noble lie, there will always be this creation of kind of a moral order to explain why power is being applied the way that it is, and that is always vulnerable to this, or that space is just going to be filled. I don't know. I kind of rambled on there for a bit, but do you have any thoughts on that one?
You're saying that you're rambling on to someone who holds spaces that end up lasting 4 hours, where I'm the only one talking. But, yeah, look, this is what I would say about that. So Machiavelli famously gives us, this is in chapter 15 of The Prince, this teaching on effectual truth. He says, I'm no longer going to concern myself with these theoretical idealism sort of projects. He has in mind, in particular, Augustine's City of God, because Machiavelli is always going to be criticizing Christianity, but also and especially Plato and Aristotle with their best cities in speech. But this is what people need to understand about effectual truth, the consequences of it. In other words, what Machiavelli is saying is, I'm not concerned with the truth. I'm just concerned with the truth only insofar as it gets the job done. Now, two things to keep in mind about that. First, that's going to be, in many respects, the origin of modern science. The fact that we model things based upon mathematics without really much concern of, is that really, what's going on in the phenomena? Well, it doesn't matter. We can model it. That's all. So there's that. And then, probably more importantly, philosophically speaking, you can only disregard the truth for so long, and associatedly bask in the glories of the emphasis on effectual truth, whether or not it's true or not, without eventually coming to the conclusion, well, I mean, is there really even any such thing as truth? So we have a kind of seedling there of this kind of relativism or nihilism that's going afoot. That can only last for so long. And that's exactly what happens with classical liberalism, which, again, Strauss argues at least begins with Machiavelli. Once you get to the time of just right around Kant and a little bit afterwards, that's where we're going to see the first occurrence of the word nihilism, which is to say there's a crisis wherein people no longer really think that reason itself can give us the answers to whatever this thing called the good life is. And it might in fact be the case that the good life is nothing more than these sort of ideal things that Machiavelli himself is criticizing, is saying, don't be concerned with that in chapter 15 of The Prince, right? Just be concerned with what gets the job done. In other words, the rise of an emphasis on all practicality with little regard for theory. And that's reflected, by the way, in the courses of politics departments, as you were saying. So that's really what happens, is that the preconditions for classical liberalism, which we should always understand as nothing more than radical toleration. That's what it is. At the end of the day, that's what the premises of liberalism are. They end up undercutting themselves because they begin to reveal themselves as the premises. Many people signed on to this without knowing that's what the premises are. Mm-hmm. So this deep critique, this criticism of Christianity itself at the very heart of classical liberalism, which is to say modernity, which is to say radical toleration, begins to shine through. And then what do you do once you've torn down all and placed your bets on this new thing under the sun simply because it gives you the luxuries of technology, which again issue forth from the emphasis, the consequences of Machiavelli's effectual truth. What do you have left if you no longer believe in the tradition that you've replaced it with, of which you no longer believe in that either? Well, that's where we have ourselves, the sort of the postmodern world we live in. So
Yeah, I the kind of comparison I try to use to help people, because the problem is that this stuff works, right? The classical liberalism, Machiavellian understandings of politics, the reason that we use them is that they do work, at least for a time. And so you can't look at these and say, oh, well, I just dismiss them because they don't function. Or no, actually, not only do they work better in when they're in competition with some of these other traditions, these other understandings. The problem is that ultimately what you're doing is you basically have a Jenga tower. And you're like, well, I can knock out a brick here and I can build it higher and I can scale things up and I can make this more complicated. And this works. It works really well. The first couple times you take a brick out of the bottom of the tower, it feels like it has basically no cost to what you're doing. The stability is still there. It's fine. And you're like, oh, look, my tower is getting taller and taller. It's getting more complex. There's more going on with it. But eventually you start realizing that the cost of building this tower higher, of scaling things up, of increasing the level of complexity you're building on this base that you've been hollowing out, is that the stability is waning. And the only thing you know how to do is continue to build the tower higher. And so the more you apply these Machiavellian politics, it's not that they stop working. The more that you apply classical liberalism, it's not that it necessarily stops working in and of itself, but that it's hollowing out the base that you didn't really think a whole lot about when you started constructing this thing. And suddenly your need to constantly use this creates a situation where your next move might be the one that actually just topples the entire thing over.
yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And let me sort of emphasize something, because a lot of people will mistakenly infer that what I'm saying, or what I'm suggesting here, is that modernity bad. That's not what's being said at all. No one can deny the comfortability of the technology that we have in the world we live in. But the question ultimately concerns is, look, there are many sacred truths that most people no longer believe in. The thrust of the kind of nihilism that's afoot with us now, again, sort of attendant upon this effectual truth instead of the truth, is either, on the one hand, you move in the direction of a radical decisionism, where you have the various thinkers such as Heidegger and Schmidt, I suppose, to some extent, of simply resolve, right? This the rise of the will, right? This is Nietzsche's will to power, the rise of doing something just because it's a sort of a release of the power or the strength might makes right to do it, or, and this is where Strauss enters into things, and particularly with his reading of Machiavelli, says, well, look, yes, there's no going back. Even Nietzsche says that. Heidegger believes that. Strauss certainly believes that. There's no going back. The question, though, is, do we still have some things to learn from these thinkers, and we're not exactly beyond them yet? And that's the key, right? Because it's none other Machiavelli himself who teaches us this. Who is Machiavelli relying upon for the source of his new wisdom? Well, the ancients. Livy in particular. He's pointing back to Xenophon as well. So all of these things are simply to suggest, and this is what Strauss always argues, is he says, he actually hilariously says, we need to wipe the dust off of our old books and go back and start reading them more seriously, as if they still have something to teach us that we don't know. Because the greatest bias or premise, mistakenly for us today, is the belief in progress. We simply believe that we are progressing, right? This is why in politics you'll always hear people say, you're on the wrong side of history, we're on the right side of history. Look, no one denies technology, no one denies the comforts of modernity and postmodernity. The fact, though, is that have we emphasized the practice that's required to have that luxury in our lives to such a great extent that we no longer value serious theoretical considerations or thought in order to better guide that practice? That's the key, right? Is so we have these technocrats, etc., who are these blind giants. They have no knowledge of the humanities or what have you. They're just making things up as they go along. And the question is, well, have people already that was already invented in the teachings of, for instance, prudence and things like that of the classics? And so that's ultimately what's at stake and what's going on here with this the so-called return movements, or certainly at least the return movement for Strauss. So.
It's interesting. Obviously, Strauss sets up this kind of contrast between the ancients and the moderns. I'm not. This is really only I have got one and a half of Strauss's books under my belt, so I'm far from any kind of authority on this. But as I understand it, this is a theme running through his work. But Machiavelli specifically goes as he as Strauss points out, and as you're pointing out here, specifically goes to the ancients as a way to kind of undermine the authority of current Christianity. He talks about in Art of War how the ancient troops were better, their modes and orders were better because they were worried about being enslaved or murdered if they lost a war, as opposed to where Christians' belief, that they basically don't do that, means that they don't have to fight, for their lives. He refers to Livy as his own kind of Bible to kind of validate the things and the criticisms that he's bringing against kind of the current order. That would seem like an appeal to the ancients in this case. So why would Strauss see Machiavelli as a figure who's kind of rupturing this continuity of philosophy, creating this distinction between ancient and the moderns, if he is himself kind of calling back to the ancients in a way to criticize what was, I guess, more modern in his time?
Yeah, that gets us sort of into the depths, or we could say at the frontier of serious scholarship on Strauss. Is that many people say that because Strauss himself seems to suggest that there is this true divide between the ancients and the moderns. It's not at all clear that that's what's going on in Strauss. And in fact, Strauss says in On Tyranny, in the exchange, in the restatement with Kojev, that he says perhaps the moderns were too successful. And what he means by that is they were too successful at using the same kind of esoteric writing that the ancients used. And it was the later moderns who failed to pick up on that. Strauss is famously going to argue that Rousseau was the last of the great ones, and then it's all lost on thinkers such as Kant, etc., until Nietzsche comes to the fore very briefly, and then Heidegger it's lost in many respects on Heidegger. But that's going to be the key, is again, just to emphasize what Strauss finds in Machiavelli is that there is the separation of wisdom as such, in other words, philosophy, from any kind of teaching of moderation or prudence. That's going to be what's new under the sun. And so to the extent that Machiavelli is a modern, it's going to be that. But to the extent that he's still an ancient, it's going to be the fact that he is deeply concerned with the human things. Strauss is going to say that Machiavelli is in fact very close to Plato and the turn towards the human things. In other words, elevating the primacy of the human things. Now, I should add, though, that this is sort of, one could say, possibly the very deep aspects of Strauss on Machiavelli, is that Strauss links Machiavelli. He specifically says, when in the text On Tyranny and the restatement of On Tyranny, which I encourage readers to read On Tyranny, because he has a lot to say about Machiavelli and On Tyranny, and particularly the restatement. He's speaking of Vogelin in the exchange with Vogelin, and he says, the problem is that it's not sufficiently attended to that Machiavelli was influenced by the biblical tradition. This is to say that it's his deep criticism of his criticism and transformation of the Christian tradition. Now, what this means for Strauss ultimately concerns what Strauss refers to as the cave beneath the cave. He says, our problem in modernity is that we're no longer simply in Plato's cave, the natural condition of ignorance. We're in a deeper cave. So we have to climb out of this deeper cave which is to say of ideology, just to get to the natural level of ignorance. And okay, well, where does that initially begin? Where does the cave beneath the cave really begin? And Strauss never really openly says it, but to the extent that he does, he links it with Machiavelli there. Machiavelli is influenced by the biblical tradition. What Strauss is claiming is that it's Christianity itself that's really going to constitute the more powerful lining of this cave beneath the cave. Now, that's some dangerous thought right there. I mean, it just goes without saying. But that's ultimately what's going to be going on with this critique of Christianity in Machiavelli and how Strauss uses it. Now, that's where I always emphasize to people, there's Machiavelli, and then there's Strauss's Machiavelli. We always have to make sure that we're clear on that. So,
yeah, that was going to be my next question, because Strauss speaks specifically, he emphasizes in the book, because the book is the way it's constructed. We didn't quite get into this, but we might as well now. The way it's constructed is kind of interesting. It's only got 4 chapters, despite being 300 pages plus another 50 or so pages of notes. And the footnotes are extensive, and it's one of those things where if you blink, you might miss a critical footnote that unlocks a whole thing. There are footnotes that go on for an essay in some cases in this, and so that is an interesting way to lay this out itself. It's also broken into the 4 chapters, which are kind of the 2 approaches that Machiavelli has: the Prince, the discourses, and then Strauss's own thoughts on how on what kind of Machiavelli's trying to do. And the thing that Strauss points out over and over again is that Machiavelli is using the immunity of the commentator, right? He's invoking this immunity of the commentator. Is like, well, I'm just looking at this. I'm just commenting on this thing that this other guy said. Maybe these are my opinions. Maybe they're not. That they, but I'm not, I'm not throwing all this out there as my own words. And of course, the wink there is that is also what Strauss is doing through here by saying, well, I'm just commenting on Machiavelli and what he might say about, say, something like Christianity. You're never sure, is that what Machiavelli was saying, or is that what Strauss is saying, unless you're very familiar in an intimate way with kind of everything that Machiavelli said throughout all of his writings.
You've got your finger on the pulse of the most difficult thing about Strauss. Strauss is not at all easy to read. He's very difficult because you can't simply quote Strauss and say, this is Strauss speaking. Well, hold on. Is it Strauss speaking in the narrator's voice for somebody else? Along with, exactly like you said, the sort of hint, hint, wink, wink kind of movement there. But the text itself is understood, and I think rightly so, to be Strauss's, just about Strauss's most difficult text. Now that cuts 2 ways. On the one hand, it's great reading. He does a wonderful job of just going over the various teachings of Machiavelli as he interprets it, which is perfectly clear on the surface. But then it's also got this second layer, which is, I mean, it's not even subtle. You don't even get a few pages into the text and you realize he's going very heavy on what we would otherwise refer to as numerology. He's counting sections of the text. He's counting paragraphs. And in fact, he even has, it's in this book where he has what's referred to as the golden sentence of Strauss, which is to say the surface of things. He's talking about the surface level of writing. In other words, what's literally clear on the page. He says the surface of things is, that's where you find the depth of things, and only there. Well, that's interesting. What exactly do you mean there, Strauss? And then he elaborates that throughout by saying that how should we read Machiavelli? He's very clear. How do we read Machiavelli? Sort of like the hint, hint, wink. How do you read me, reader? Someone who's been schooled in this apparent kind of numerology or something like that. And the endnotes are just unbelievable. It seems to be the case that there's serious numerology going on in the endnotes. He cites things with what I refer to as machine gun fire, very often without any explanation. And then you go to wherever those might be in the primary text that he's citing, and they might not, in fact, justify what he's saying. So you realize very quickly, because of just how many of them there are, it's a deluge. You realize that studying at any kind of a deep level what Strauss could be up to is something of a life's work in itself.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, this is not my favorite thing about him. This is this
I'm
this
right
is
there. I'm right there with you.
yeah.
I don't like it. I don't like it.
Yeah, this does not win me over. You know, I'm still looking into, due to the number of people who I respect, who respect Strauss's work. I'm trying to gather as much as I need to. But honestly, this does not drive me towards wanting to really go deep, and not because the book itself. You know, I found the book helpful in a number of ways. I found the surface level reading, you know, the first pass that I did on this is something that I don't regret, and it's something that I think is useful and helps to illuminate, as you said, even if you're just doing that surface level reading, still helps you to better understand. You know, it just, if nothing else, as a kind of a strong commentary to help you better elucidate the different things that Machiavelli is discussing. But I don't want to play like cryptographic games with my philosophy. Philosophy's already challenging enough to it. Like maybe maybe that just reveals that I'm not complicated enough, that I don't have what it takes to grind through Strauss. But it's like, man, I have other philosophers I got to read. If you're gonna make me dedicate my entire life just to reading, the few books that you have correctly, then I don't know, man. It makes me want to move on to something else.
Yeah, let me say, because I completely agree with you on that. The way that I describe it is trying to read Strauss almost immediately causes reader fatigue, because and I honestly don't believe that Strauss should be taught at certainly not at the undergraduate level, and I really don't believe Strauss should be taught at the graduate level either. I think that Strauss should be one of those things that if students want to pursue it, it's kind of an independent course with a particular professor. And the reason is I have seen so many people simply go insane. I mean, they don't think they have, but I mean, they're counting words, they're counting paragraphs, they're looking for the so-called magic numbers, things like 13, 7, these kinds of things. They're always looking for the middle. What's the middle of them, right? What's the middle? And it just causes people become intoxicated with trying to solve puzzles, which is understandable. That's perfectly understandable. But at what cost, right? I mean, there's a difference between interpretation and overinterpretation. Strauss himself is very specific about the kind of rules that he follows for this, but no one really attends to those because they want to look for even deeper things. And then it just becomes a kind of, like you were saying, it's almost like a mathematical puzzle where you just walk away thinking, "Oh my God, man, other books I can read, better time spent elsewhere," or something like that. So,
Well, we have already closed in almost an hour at this point, and we have not even touched the surface. But I guess before we move on to any questions from the audience, my last thing would, what would be maybe one or two concrete insights that you think that maybe we haven't yet touched on, that Strauss brings forward for someone who otherwise has maybe only read The Prince and maybe given a cursory glance at kind of discourses. What are some of the things that Strauss really pulls out of the text for you?
yeah, I would say probably the most important thing, at least that occurs to me right now, that readers would get on any kind of a reading, not even a deep reading, because it's right there at the surface, would be something like the following. Uh, there's the issue of Averroes in the text. Now, I won't go into great detail about that, but that's going to be something important because it concerns this issue of biblical criticism. And attendant on that is his discussion of the role of conscience, uh, not conscious, but conscience, uh, and Christianity in the text, because what he's doing by invoking the issue of conscience in the context of Christianity is he's bringing to the surface the possibilities for a new politics, I guess we could say, of Christianity itself, in order to ameliorate or reconcile itself to a world in which uh, being good is so difficult because so many people are bad, as Machiavelli says. So there's that, and then of course the way he ends the text is really quite amazing. People should really read those last 10 or 15 pages of the text. What he argues ultimately is that one has to understand that this thing we call the Enlightenment, it presents itself as a great expansion of our horizon, very liberating.
Mhm.
And what Strauss says is it could very well be, in fact, the case. In other words, Strauss is saying it is the case, that it is a great darkening, a contraction, a great contraction of our horizon. And how do we find our way back to a more expanded horizon? Well, return to the great books, right? So that's just the first things that come to me right there on that. So.
No, absolutely. All right, guys. Well, like I said, I don't know if this was I don't know if this is us selling the book necessarily, but I do think it's an interesting read. I do think that it creates a framework for understanding Machiavelli that is very helpful in certain areas. And, you don't have to, like we said, you don't have to dedicate yourself to, the entire life's work of trying to excavate everything that Strauss meant. If you just want to give it the pass, that'll help you to kind of have a better grasp on Machiavelli in general, though the depth is certainly there if you would like to do that. So, Stranger, before we head to the questions of the people, where can people find your spaces, your writings, everything else?
Yeah, so my recordings that I do, the sort of the lectures, I guess you could say, they're at my website, athenscorner.com. I put a number of things out for free. I put as much out for free as possible, so long as I can still just cover the costs on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and stuff with Athens Corner. And then just find me, Athenian Stranger, Athens_Stranger on Twitter. You'll find all my recorded spaces. Which, by the way, is just so people know, is never heavily Straussian or anything like that. Just,
You're saying what you mean, even if the guy you're talking
yes,
about isn't.
yes, and
Yeah.
and also I'm always perfectly clear whenever I bring up Strauss that I'm bringing him up. I don't ever try to simply presume him or smuggle him into any interpretations or something. That's never ever what I do. So
Yeah,
that
it really is a strange thing. I having written my own book, which I am not going to claim is anywhere near as complex as a Strauss's book, but I recognize that currents are always going to exist, for at different levels. That's always going to be true. That's what makes, especially the truly great works, what they are, is that the first reading is never enough. That there's always another layer to peel back. There's a reason that people can study Plato for literally, thousands of years or whatever, and it just doesn't. There's always some other little bit that you can kind of go back to and understand. So it's not that these books don't have that depth, because they do. I don't think that's imagined on Strauss's part. It's just like, if you're gonna be laying things out, at least do your best to lay about as in a way that is as easily communicatable as possible. And then if someone can't grasp it on their first pass through, well, that's on them. They have to read a couple more times, but at least you did your best when you're actually actively obfuscating the truth in there, just to kind of run people in circles. At that point, it makes me feel like, okay, well, we're just doing this so we can say, it's like the pretentious prog rock band. You know what I mean? Like, maybe I didn't need 24 minutes of that guitar solo. I could have gotten it in like 8. That probably would have been enough.
exactly, exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
All right. Well, let's go over to the questions of the people here. Looks like we just got Robert right now. Robert Weinsfield says, Strauss, smart but annoying. Where are my descendant right J's at? Yes, always an adventure. Thank you very much, Robert. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up, everybody, but thank you so much for coming by. Make sure you check out Athenian Stranger. Like I said, we only got to the very tip of this topic, but there's plenty of great content for you to check out with him. And of course, if it's your first time on this channel, make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications, the bell, everything, so you can catch these streams when they go live. If you would like to get my book, The Total State, you can do that on Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, Books A Million, all your favorite bookstores. And of course, if you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure that you subscribe to the Auron Macintyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.